comedian David Boyle, and I'm quitting alcohol. So here we are. Maybe I should have one of those fucking Buddhist bells, the one that goes doing, or maybe I'll just om. Class is in session. So this is the first week of the wisdom of Evan. And there were a lot of good articles this week, but I narrowed it down to one. I tell you what, the fucking articles he writes are unbelievable. They're just so fucking good. There was another one I was going to read out. Maybe I'll read it out another week. It was called A Structural Action Plan for Personal Freedom, and it was very, very good. But I'm sticking with this one. Partially because it's quicker and partially because I think maybe it's more interesting. Anyway, class is in session, kids. Get your notepads out. Pay attention. Pay attention. So here it is. The article is called The Boycott Question. What actually works against transnational capital and what is just noise? By Evan from Twitter. This is Cold State Capital. It's no longer Evan from Twitter, even though it is Evan from Twitter, but it's coldstatecapital.com. Here it is. Most boycotts, as popularly practiced, do not work. Not because the cause is wrong, but because the mechanism is misaligned with the target. The structural dynamics that govern how transnational capital actually responds to pressure are well understood, historically validated, and almost universally ignored by the movements that need them most. This report maps what the evidence says, where the leverage actually lies, and what citizens can do that goes beyond the symbolic. Core problem: capital has no ideology. This starting point is a structural fact that most activist movements refuse to internalize. The transnational private sector, the web of financial, military, consumer, and tech industrial complexes that operate across borders and above states, does not respond to moral argument. It responds to profit consequence. Ethical constraints become operationally binding only when non-compliance is more expensive than compliance. Moral appeals, public outrage, media campaigns, and political pressure that do not translate into measurable economic cost are noise. They are acknowledged, managed, and ultimately ignored. This is not cynicism, it is the observed behavioral record across every major justice movement of the last century. The anti-apartheid movement provides the clearest historical validation. The moral case against apartheid was widely understood for decades. The world knew, and nothing changed. Policy change correlated not with the moral argument reaching critical mass, but the economic sanctions, institutional divestment, and the accumulated cost of maintaining the system exceeding the costs of dismantling it. The moral argument was necessary because it provided the legitimacy basis for the economic action, but it was not sufficient. Economic encoding was the binding constraint. That distinction between necessary and sufficient is where most boycott movements fail. They generate the necessary condition, moral clarity, and then wait for it to produce results on its own. It does not. It cannot. Capital will be progressive, conservative, environmentalist, or extractivist, whichever position the current market rewards. The public's task is not to convince capital to be moral. It is to ensure that only moral positions are profitable. What actually works? The mechanisms that produce real behavior change from transnational capital operate at 3 levels in ascending order of effectiveness. The first is consumer boycott producing measurable revenue decline. This is the most visible and least effective mechanism, not because it is useless, but because it is extremely difficult to sustain at a scale that crosses the threshold. A boycott that reduces a company's revenue by 2% is a rounding error managed by the PR department. A boycott that reduces revenue by 15% over 2 or more quarters reaches the boardroom. The threshold exists, and below it, the target will manage the moral pressure through token concessions and narrative management. Most consumer boycotts never reach the threshold. They make participants feel righteous and leave the target's profit and loss fundamentally undisturbed. The exceptions are instructive. When consumer boycotts concentrate on a narrow range of highly visible bands with consumer-facing revenue models, they can cross threshold. The mechanism works best against companies whose brand equity is their primary asset, where reputational damage translates directly into lost sales. Fast food chains, consumer electronics, fashion brands. It works worst against upstream producers, financial intermediaries, the defense contractors whose revenue comes from institutional contracts invisible to consumers. You cannot boycott BlackRock by closing your personal brokerage account. Their revenue comes from institutional mandates that no consumer action touches. The second mechanism, the one with genuine structural teeth, is institutional divestment. When universities, pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, and government procurement agencies exclude a target, they affect its cost of capital. This is categorically different from affecting its revenue. A company that loses consumer revenue adjusts its marketing. A company whose cost of capital rises because institutional investors are pulling out faces a structural constraint on its ability to finance operations, expand, and service debt. Institutional divestment reaches the target's financing, not just the cash register. The anti-apartheid movement's decisive phase was not the consumer boycott of South African goods, though that contributed to the moral atmosphere. It was the cascade of institutional divestment. Universities divesting endowments, pension funds excluding South African assets, banks refusing to roll over sovereign debt, that made maintaining the system more expensive than dismantling it. The divestment campaign took years to build and required sustained organizational infrastructure that most current movements have not built. The third mechanism is procurement, exclusion by major institutional buyers. When a government agency, a university system, or a large corporate purchaser changes its procurement policy to exclude a target, the excluded firm faces structural economic pressure that cannot be managed through consumer-facing PR. Procurement exclusion is quiet, institutional, and devastating because it removes entire revenue streams rather than shaving margins. What does not work and why? Consumer boycotts that fail to cross economic threshold are managed indefinitely. The target acknowledges the concern, issues a statement, perhaps makes a token gesture, and waits for attention to move on. The mechanism is well understood inside corporate communications departments. The playbook is validate the emotion, contest the framing, make a symbolic concession, outlast the news cycle. Most boycotts are defeated by this playbook within weeks. Boycotts that target the wrong node in the value chain fail structurally. If the entity you are boycotting is a retail-facing subsidiary of a conglomerate whose real revenue comes from defense contracts, institutional lending, or commodity trading, your boycott affects a revenue stream the parent company considers expendable. The entity you are hurting is not the entity making the decisions you want changed. Boycotts without institutional follow-through generate moral visibility with no economic consequence. 1 million people sharing a hashtag produces zero cost to the target. A single pension fund divesting 500 million produces measurable cost. The asymmetry is brutal, but it is real. Social media activism in particular creates a dangerous illusion of impact. The visibility of online campaigns is often inversely proportional to their economic encoding. The louder and the more viral the campaign, the less likely it is to have translated moral energy into financial cost. Virality optimizes for emotional engagement. Economic pressure optimizes for institutional leverage. These are different skills, different organizations, and different timelines. The dark corollary. When boycotts are captured, there is a harder truth that must be confronted. Transnational capital will adopt moral positions instrumentally when doing so is profitable and abandon them when the profit profile changes. Every corporate adoption of a moral position must be tested. Did the position become profitable, or did the actor become moral? If the adoption coincides with market incentive shifts, the morality is instrumental and will be abandoned when the incentive shifts again. This means that even successful boycott campaigns carry a capture risk. The target changes its surface behavior, rebrands, adopts the language of the movement, and uses the new moral positioning for marketing, ESG scoring, and reputational benefit, while maintaining the underlying structural relationship. The moral encoding was sufficient to change the label. It was not sufficient to change the machinery. Activists who celebrate the surface change without tracking whether the structural relationship has shifted are celebrating their own instrumentalization. The test is always follow the money, not the press release. How citizens actually take charge beyond the boycott. Build parallel economic infrastructure. The most durable form of resistance to transnational capital is not opposing its system, but building an alternative one. Wherever the extracting class has withdrawn from genuine provision, the question is what fills the vacuum. Community currencies, cooperative economic structures, mutual aid networks, local credit systems that bypass external shocks, barter networks that function during state failure. These are not romantic holdovers from a pre-capitalist era. They are operational sovereignty at the community level. The evidence is unambiguous. Communities with pre-existing parallel structures, informal economies, community security networks, mutual aid systems, religious institutions providing social services expand when state provision contracts. These are proto-sovereignty formations. They survive state failure. They survive sanctions. They survive the withdrawal of transnational capital. Communities without them fragment. The Zapatista autonomous municipalities, Black church economic cooperatives in the American South, early Muslim community institutions operating in hostile environments all demonstrate that ethical parallel sovereignty is durable against state pressure when it genuinely delivers governance goods. 30 or more years of sustained operation in some cases against active opposition. Climb the value chain. For resource-rich countries, the single most important sovereignty metric is not what you own in the ground, it is what you control in the processing chain. The entity that controlled the processing step captured that multiplication. Geological sovereignty, owning the ore, captured the base. Industrial sovereignty, owning the refining and manufacturing, would capture the multiplication. The gap between the two is the capture gap, and it determines who actually extracts the wealth, regardless of who technically owns the resource. Citizens and states that want sovereignty must focus relentlessly on closing this gap, moving the exit point up the value chain so that the domestic economy captures more of the multiplication at each stage. Every stage climbed, combined with selling the output in your own currency rather than the dollar, compounds the sovereignty gain. This is harder than a boycott. It takes decades. It requires education systems that produce engineers and chemists, not just extractors. It requires industrial policy that foreign capital will resist. And it works. Protect civilizational infrastructure. The variable that determines whether a population survives state failure or transnational abandonment as a functioning society, rather than disintegrating into atomized individuals, is not GDP or military strength. It is civilizational infrastructure, shared moral architecture, community structures for mutual aid, cultural identity independent of consumer economy, and governance experience outside state-managed institutions. Populations that maintain these structures self-organize after crisis. Populations conditioned by consumer state architecture, whose identity derives from consumption, career, and state-provided validation, cannot. This is the deepest form of sovereignty. It is non-boycottable, non-sanctionable, and non-extractable. No transnational actor can take it from a population that maintains it. No transnational actor can give it to a population that has lost it. It must be built and maintained by the community itself, and its maintenance is the most fundamental act of resistance available to any population. Institutional capture of the state itself. Most states operate within a dual constraint envelope. External constraints from the international system and internal constraints from the transnational capital that has captured domestic policy. A boycott movement that targets a corporation while ignoring the captured state that protects that corporation is fighting the symptom. The structural fight is over who controls the state's regulatory and procurement apparatus. Citizens who organize to change procurement policy at the municipal, state, and national level, who campaign for pension fund divestment mandates, who push for regulatory changes that raise the cost of extractive behavior, are encoding moral demands into institutional economic structures. This is slower than a hashtag. It is where the actual leverage lives. The bottom line, boycotts work when they cross economic threshold, which most do not. They work best when combined with institutional divestment and procurement exclusion, which transforms moral energy into financial cost the target cannot manage through PR. They fail when they remain at the consumer level, target the wrong node in the value chain, or substitute visibility for economic impact. The deeper question, how citizens reclaim sovereignty from transnational capital, is not answered by boycotts at all. It is answered by building parallel economic infrastructure that functions independently of the extractive system, climbing the value chain so that the domestic economies capture the multiplication rather than exporting raw materials for someone else to process, protecting the civilizational infrastructure that allows communities to self-organize when states fail or are captured, and fighting the institutional battles over procurement, pension fund mandates, and regulatory policy where moral demands become binding economic constraints. The uncomfortable truth is that the easiest forms of resistance, the consumer boycott, the shared graphic, the public pledge, are the least effective. And the most effective forms, institutional organizing, parallel economic construction, value chain development, civilizational maintenance, are the hardest, the slowest, and the least photogenic. That asymmetry is not an accident. It is the system working as designed. Alrighty, you can chew on that for a little while. Class dismissed. That'll do, and I'll see you the fuck later.